The first thing I remember is the sound of my father's voice reading me stories about the old republic, back when senators actually believed words could change the galaxy. And I suppose that's fitting because I spent my entire life trying to prove he was right, even as everything around me screamed he was wrong. I'm recording this now because the medics say I have maybe 3 days left. The Poison Kiza's agent slipped into my system during those peace negotiations on Hosnian Prime, finally doing what the Empire, the First Order, and 50 years of war couldn't manage. And I need someone to understand that everything I did, every compromise and sacrifice and moment of calculated ruthlessness, I did without the Force, without visions or prescience or mystical certainty, just intelligence and instinct and the crushing weight of being my father's daughter in a galaxy that kept trying to kill hope. My name is Leia Organa, and I was born on an asteroid called Polis Massa in the final hours of the Republic's death, though I wouldn't learn that truth for 19 years. The earliest memories that feel real are of Alderaan, the way sunlight caught on the crystal waterfalls near the palace, the smell of wildflowers in the mountain meadows, the taste of sweetbread my mother would sneak me before formal dinners when I was supposed to be too dignified for such treats. I was raised as a princess, which sounds like a fairy tale until you understand that being Alderaanian royalty meant being trained from childhood in diplomacy, economics, military history, xenosociology, and the subtle art of making powerful people believe compromise was their idea. My adoptive parents, and they were my real parents in every way that mattered, raised me to lead, to serve, to believe that privilege was a responsibility, not a right. My father, Bail Organa, was everything a senator should be, and almost none of them were. He'd sit with me in his study after returning from Coruscant, and I could smell the exhaustion on him, that particular scent of recycled air and stress sweat that clung to everyone who spent too long in the Imperial Senate watching democracy die by procedure. He'd tell me about the bills he'd tried to pass, the relief efforts he'd attempted to organize, the systematic way Emperor Palpatine was dismantling everything the Republic had stood for while pretending to preserve it. "Remember, Leia," he'd say, his voice heavy with a weariness I was too young to fully understand. "Tyranny doesn't usually arrive with stormtroopers. It arrives with paperwork, with emergency powers that never expire, with people so afraid of chaos that they'll accept any order no matter how unjust." I was 7 years old when I first understood my father was part of the rebellion. I'd found a encrypted datapad in his office. I was always too curious, always reading things I wasn't supposed to. And when he discovered me trying to crack the security protocols, he sat me down and explained carefully that some things were worth dying for, that the Empire was built on fear and violence and the erasure of everything good the Republic had tried to be, and that he and others were working to restore freedom even though it meant committing treason every single day. He asked me if I understood why he had to do this, why he couldn't just accept Imperial rule and keep our family safe. I told him I understood. I was lying. I was 7 and terrified he'd be taken away. But I wanted desperately to be brave enough to mean it. My mother, Leia Organa, taught me different lessons. Where my father dealt in grand political principles, my mother worked in the practical reality of power. She'd been Queen of Alderaan since before I was born, and she showed me how to read a room, how to identify allies and opponents in the first 30 seconds of a conversation, how to make strategic concessions that looked like generosity while preserving your core objectives. "Your father fights for what should be," she told me during one of our walks through the palace gardens. The smell of golden blossom making everything feel peaceful, even as we discussed rebellion and resistance. But you need to understand what is. Idealism without pragmatism just gets good people killed. Never forget that. I was adopted, though I wouldn't learn the full truth until much later. They told me when I was 12, sitting me down in the same study where my father had confessed his treason, and explaining that I'd been born to another family during the chaos of the Republic's fall, that my birth mother had died and they'd taken me in. They said they loved me as their own daughter, which I'd never doubted, and that my heritage didn't change who I was or what I'd become. I accepted this easily because it was true. They were my parents in every way that mattered, but there was something they weren't telling me, some detail held back. And that omission would haunt me later when Vader spoke my name like a curse, and I felt something crack in the foundation of everything I'd believed about myself. My childhood on Alderaan was privileged and purposeful, comfortable and constantly challenging. I studied xenobiology and military tactics, ancient philosophy and contemporary economics, learning a dozen languages and how to fire a blaster with equal facility. I was groomed for the Senate from age 14, attending diplomatic functions and learning the subtle violence of politics, how to smile while refusing, how to build coalitions among people who hated each other, how to survive in rooms where words were weapons and everyone was armed. I was good at it, better than good. By 16, I was accompanying my father to Senate sessions, watching the Empire's bureaucratic machinery crush dissent with procedural votes and committee assignments, and I was already planning how I'd fight back when my turn came. The Clone Wars were history by the time I was old enough to understand what they'd meant. Just stories about Jedi generals and droid armies and a republic that had died long before Palpatine formally dissolved it. But the scars were everywhere. You could see it in the veterans with their 1,000-yard stares, in the planets still recovering from battles fought years earlier, in the way people flinched when they saw stormtroopers, even though they wore different armor than the clones who'd saved them before betraying them. My father told me about Order 66, about watching friends and colleagues, Jedi he'd worked with, trusted, admired, being murdered by their own soldiers, their bodies left in the streets like garbage. He told me this because he wanted me to understand what the Empire was capable of, what happened when you built a government on violence and lies. I was 18 when I became the youngest senator in Imperial history, appointed to complete my father's term when his health began failing, or that was the official story. Really, the rebellion needed a new public face, someone young and idealistic seeming who the Empire wouldn't immediately suspect of sedition. I arrived on Coruscant feeling like I was descending into a tomb. The whole planet smelled like metal and pollution. The sun filtered through so much artificial infrastructure that natural light felt alien, and the Senate building itself was a monument to the Republic's murder, still bearing the same architecture while serving a completely different master. I gave my first speech about relief efforts for war-torn systems and sustainable development in the mid-rim, and I watched bored senators doze through my carefully researched proposals while ISB agents in the gallery cataloged everyone who applauded too enthusiastically. That was when I learned the real lesson of imperial politics. Nothing you said in the Senate mattered. Every vote was predetermined, every debate was theater, every passionate speech about justice or freedom was just noise that the Empire tolerated because it made their tyranny look legitimate. The actual work happened in back rooms and encrypted communications, encoded messages hidden in diplomatic pouches and supply requisitions that concealed weapons shipments. I lived two lives: the public princess senator who attended state functions and made speeches nobody listened to, and the private rebel coordinator who used her diplomatic immunity to move intelligence and supplies, to recruit sympathetic officers, to slowly build a network that might, possibly, have a chance of destroying the machine that had devoured the Republic. I met Luke Skywalker on the Death Star, though I didn't know his name yet when I saw him standing in my cell, wearing stolen stormtrooper armor that didn't fit right, telling me he was there to rescue me with an expression that mixed terror and determination in equal measure. I was 19 years old, and I'd been imprisoned for 3 days, tortured by Vader himself and an interrogation droid that had violated my mind, searching for rebellion secrets I'd managed, barely, not to reveal. I'd watched Grand Moff Tarkin order Alderaan destroyed, stood at a viewport while the Death Star's superlaser turned my entire world into an expanding debris field, felt the deaths of billions of people, including my parents, like a hole torn in my chest, and I'd still refused to tell them anything real about the rebellion because some part of me understood that if I broke, if I gave them what they wanted, then Alderaan died for nothing. When Luke appeared in that cell, I thought I was hallucinating. Nobody staged rescues from Imperial battle stations. Nobody was that brave or that stupid. But he was real, and so was Han Solo, a smuggler who'd clearly expected an easy job and found himself in the middle of something far more serious than he wanted, and Chewbacca and old Ben Kenobi, and they got me out. We escaped while Vader and Obi-Wan dueled. I felt something when Kenobi died, some disturbance I couldn't name, like reality stuttering, and we brought the Death Star plans to the rebellion on Yavin 4. I'd lost my home, my parents, my entire world, and I had approximately 6 hours to grieve before I needed to coordinate the attack that might destroy the Empire's ultimate weapon before it destroyed us. The medal ceremony after Yavin felt obscene. We'd won, yes. Luke had made an impossible shot and destroyed the Death Star, had saved the rebellion and maybe given Hope a chance to survive, but I'd lost everything. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Alderaan dying, felt that moment when billions of lives just stopped, when my mother and father and everyone I'd grown up with ceased to exist. The smell of the Yavin jungle was wrong, too humid, too alive, nothing like Alderaan's mountain air, and I stood there placing medals on Luke and Han while wanting to scream, while wanting to collapse, while feeling like I was already dead and just going through the motions out of habit. But I didn't collapse, couldn't afford to. The rebellion needed leadership, and I was one of the few surviving command staff after the Empire's crackdown following Yavin. So I buried my grief under duty, under the practical work of coordinating fleet movements and supply lines, under the constant pressure of being Princess Leia Organa, the girl who'd watched her world die and still kept fighting. I learned to compartmentalize, to function even when the pain was a knife in my chest, to make strategic decisions about where to commit resources, knowing that I was deciding who lived and who died with my choices. I learned to accept that hope came with a body count, and that sometimes the cost of victory was exactly the same as the cost of defeat, except you got to keep trying. Luke became a friend, then something like a brother, bound together by shared trauma and the strange certainty that we were meant to know each other. He had something I'd lost, an optimism, a belief that things could be made right, that the Empire could be defeated and the galaxy could heal. He talked about the Force like it was real, like the Jedi might actually return, and I wanted to dismiss it as mysticism, but I'd felt something when Vader tortured me, something like cold fingers in my mind, and I'd felt Obi-Wan die across the distance of space, so I didn't mock Luke's faith even though I couldn't share it. I believed in intelligence and weapons and strategy, in the practical application of force to achieve military objectives. The Force, if it existed, belonged to people like Luke. I just had courage and rage and the refusal to let the Empire win. Han was different, complicated, frustrating, compelling in ways I tried not to examine. He pretended not to care about the rebellion, claimed he was just in it for the money, but he kept staying, kept taking missions, kept putting himself at risk for a cause he insisted didn't matter to him. We fought constantly, trading insults and irritation, and underneath the bickering was something I didn't have time for, didn't want to acknowledge, because attachment was dangerous and love was a liability. and I'd already lost everyone I'd ever let myself care about. But he was there, consistently, when things were desperate and impossible, making jokes while facing death, believing in me even when I didn't believe in myself. The years between Yavin and Hoth were brutal. The Empire hunted us across the galaxy, forcing us from base to base, slowly grinding down our resources and personnel. I spent those years coordinating evacuation routes and defensive positions, recruiting new cells and managing the constant tension between different rebellion factions who agreed the Empire was evil but disagreed about everything else. I learned interrogation techniques and encryption protocols, how to identify Imperial informants, and how to make the hard call about eliminating security risks. I ordered people into situations where they'd probably die, and they went because they believed in the cause, believed in me, and their faith was a weight I carried every single day. I was 22 when we established Echo Base on Hoth, a frozen hell that smelled like ozone and ice, where the cold was so absolute it hurt to breathe, where every system required constant maintenance to prevent catastrophic failure. We'd been there for months when the Empire found us, when Imperial walkers came stalking across the snow, and we had to evacuate under fire, knowing we'd lose people in the chaos. I coordinated the evacuation from the command center until the last possible moment, calling retreat orders while blaster fire echoed through the corridors, and the walls shook from Imperial bombardment. I left on one of the last transports, and I watched through the viewport as Echo Base disappeared behind us, another temporary home destroyed, more lives lost to buy the rebellion another few months of survival. Han and I escaped on the Millennium Falcon with Chewie and 3PO, the hyperdrive damaged, the Empire pursuing us through an asteroid field where any collision could have vaporized us instantly. Han flew like he was dancing with death, threading through impossible spaces, and I tried not to think about how much I wanted him to survive, how much it would hurt if that ship hit an asteroid and he died while I watched. We hid in the asteroid worm. I can still taste the disgusting atmosphere, still smell the organic decay, and then fled to Bespin, to Cloud City, where Lando Calrissian ran a mining operation and Han thought we'd find safety. It was a trap. Of course it was a trap. Vader had been one step ahead of us the entire time, using us as bait to lure Luke. And I understood too late that we'd been useful precisely because we mattered to someone the Empire wanted. They tortured Han, not for information but to send force signals Luke would sense, and I could hear him screaming through the walls, could smell the ozone from the equipment they were using, and I couldn't do anything except watch them lower him into the carbon freezing chamber, while I screamed at Vader, at Lando, at a universe that kept taking everything I tried to hold on to. Before they froze him, Han kissed me. I told him I loved him, finally, stupidly, because I'd run out of time to pretend I didn't, and he said, "I know," with that insufferable Solo smirk, and then they froze him in carbonite and Boba Fett took him away, and I'd lost another person I loved to the Empire's cruelty. Lando helped us escape, his own messy attempt at redemption after the betrayal, and we fled Cloud City while I tried not to fall apart, tried not to acknowledge that the man I loved was trapped in carbonite being delivered to Jabba the Hutt, and I had no idea how to get him back. The rescue on Tatooine took months of planning. I infiltrated Jabba's palace disguised as the bounty hunter Boushh, playing the role with every acting skill my diplomatic training had provided, and I managed to unfreeze Han in the middle of the night while the palace slept. For 30 seconds, I had him back, held him while he recovered from hibernation sickness, felt him recognize me, tasted hope for the first time in months. And then Jabba's guards caught us, and it was over. Jabba chained me next to his throne like a prize, making me wear that obscene outfit while his court laughed and leered, reducing a princess and senator and rebellion leader to decoration, and I learned what it meant to be absolutely powerless, to have your body weaponized against you, to be displayed as a warning about what happened to women who thought they could fight the galaxy's power structures, but I killed him. When the moment came, when Luke's rescue plan descended into chaos at the Sarlacc pit, and everyone was fighting for survival, I took the chain Jabba had used to leash me, and I strangled him with it, felt his huge body thrash and struggle and finally go still, and there was a savage satisfaction in that murder that I've never apologized for. He'd turned me into an object, and I'd turned his instrument of domination into his execution. That chain smelled like sweat and humiliation and finally, justice. We regrouped on Home 1, the rebellion's flagship, and I learned about the second Death Star, another planet killer being constructed above Endor, another opportunity to strike at the Empire's heart, another desperate gamble that would either save the galaxy or destroy what remained of the rebellion. Mon Mothma gave me command of the strike team that would disable the shield generator on Endor's forest moon, trusting me with the most critical element of the attack plan, and I accepted because this was what I'd trained for, what I'd sacrificed everything for, the chance to actually hurt the Empire in ways that mattered. Endor smelled like decomposing leaves and living wood, so different from Alderaan's mountains that it hurt to breathe. We made contact with the Ewoks, primitive but brave, willing to fight against the Empire that had invaded their forest. And I learned again what I'd always known. Courage isn't about technology or training. It's about deciding some things matter more than your survival. Luke left to confront Vader, to try to redeem a father I hadn't known he had. A father who was also somehow my father, though I didn't understand that yet. And I watched him go with a cold certainty that I'd never see him again, that he was choosing death because he believed in redemption more than victory. The battle went wrong immediately. The Empire knew we were coming, had turned our trap into their trap, had let us organize our entire military operation around destroying a shield generator they'd already planned to ambush us at. We fought anyway because what else could we do? The Ewoks attacked with primitive weapons and absolute ferocity, and I coordinated our forces while dodging blaster fire and trying not to die in a forest on a moon I'd never heard of until 2 weeks earlier. Han was hit. I saw him fall and felt my heart stop, felt the universe narrow to just that moment of terror before I saw him move again, and I realized, distantly, that I'd been right to avoid attachment. That love made you vulnerable in ways no amount of courage could protect against. But we won. Somehow, impossibly, we won. Luke survived his confrontation with Vader and the Emperor. The shield generator fell. The Death Star exploded in a fireball that lit up Endor's night sky. And the Empire that had dominated the galaxy for decades began its collapse. We celebrated with the Ewoks, and I stood there feeling numb, feeling exhausted, feeling like I'd been fighting so long I'd forgotten what peace was supposed to feel like. Han held me, and we watched the fires and the fireworks, and I wanted to feel joy, wanted to feel hope, wanted to believe we'd actually won. But I couldn't shake the sense that this was just another temporary victory, that the galaxy was too broken to heal, that we'd just begin another war with different uniforms and the same underlying violence. Luke told me the truth about Vader after the celebration, told me that Darth Vader had been Anakin Skywalker, that Anakin had been our father, that I was the daughter of the greatest Jedi and the greatest Sith, that everything I'd done had been shaped by a heritage I'd never known I carried. I felt betrayed by my adoptive parents for hiding it, by the universe for making my identity into another burden, but also strangely relieved. It explained the strange certainty I'd always felt, the instincts that went beyond intelligence, the way I sometimes knew things I shouldn't know. I had the Force in my blood, but I'd never trained, never learned to use it, had relied entirely on my own mind and will and courage, and I'd survived. I'd led. I'd won. Without the Force's power, without its visions or prescience, just human intelligence and determination and the refusal to surrender. The New Republic was supposed to be different. We'd won, after all, defeated the Empire, restored democracy, created a government that would respect freedom and justice and all the ideals the old Republic had abandoned. I threw myself into the reconstruction work because that's what I did. What I'd always done, turning grief and exhaustion into purpose. I helped draft the New Republic's founding documents, negotiated with warlords and imperial remnants, tried to build something stable from the ruins of the Empire's collapse. But the work was brutally hard, complicated by a galaxy that had been traumatized by war and occupation, where former enemies had to learn to coexist, and trust was a currency nobody could afford. I married Han 5 years after Endor, and it was complicated and beautiful and doomed from the start. We loved each other desperately, that had never been in question. But we wanted different things, moved through the world in incompatible ways. He needed freedom and space and the open sky, needed to keep moving because stillness felt like death. I needed purpose and structure and the grinding work of building something that might last. We had a son, Ben, and I loved him with a fierceness that terrified me, loved him the way my parents had loved me, loved him enough to know that love alone wasn't enough to protect anyone. Ben was strong in the Force, stronger than Luke, maybe, carrying the Skywalker power in his blood, and I tried to give him to Luke for training because I didn't know how to guide someone through that particular gift. I'd made my peace with my heritage, with being Vader's daughter, but I didn't understand the Force, couldn't teach someone how to balance light and dark when I'd only ever understood the practical realities of combat and politics. So Luke took him to train with other Force-sensitive students, and I told myself I was doing the right thing, giving my son the guidance he needed, protecting him from a power I couldn't comprehend. I was wrong. Catastrophically, unforgivably wrong. Something went wrong at Luke's temple. Luke won't tell me exactly what, carries the guilt like a wound that won't heal. And Ben fell to the dark side, became Kylo Ren, joined the First Order, and became everything I'd fought against my entire life. My son, my beautiful boy, became a tool of tyranny and violence, became Vader's legacy in ways I'd prayed he'd never inherit. And I blamed myself. Blamed my political work for keeping me distant, blamed my inability to connect with his Force sensitivity, blamed the Skywalker blood for carrying darkness like a genetic disease, blamed everything except the boy himself, because acknowledging that he'd chosen this felt like admitting I'd failed at the most important duty I'd ever had. Han left after Ben fell. Not officially, we never divorced, never made it formal, but he returned to smuggling, to the life he'd had before the rebellion, running from the grief he couldn't face. I understood. I wanted to run too, wanted to abandon the political work and the resistance and the crushing responsibility of trying to prevent the First Order from becoming what the Empire had been. But I couldn't. Running was a luxury, and I'd spent my entire life accepting that my life wasn't my own, that I existed to serve something larger than personal happiness. So I stayed, built the resistance when the New Republic proved too corrupt or too frightened to confront the First Order's growth. Recruited fighters and coordinated intelligence networks, and watched history repeat itself while everyone pretended it was different this time. The resistance was smaller than the rebellion, more desperate, operating with fewer resources against an enemy that had learned from the Empire's mistakes. I was older now, 54 when we destroyed Starkiller Base, feeling every year in my bones and scars, but I'd never learned how to quit, never learned how to accept defeat while breath remained. I coordinated operations from Dakar, sending young people into combat just like I'd done decades earlier, watching them die for hope just like the generation before them. Rey arrived, strong in the Force, drawn to Luke, carrying a destiny I could sense but not understand, and I sent her to find my brother to convince him to stop hiding and fight again, knowing I was asking the impossible but having no other choice. The First Order found us on Dakar. We evacuated under fire, another base lost, another desperate retreat, history repeating with nauseating consistency, and I led the evacuation personally, because that's what you did when you were asking people to die for your decisions. I was on the bridge when Kylo Ren's fighters attacked, when his torpedoes hit and explosive decompression tried to pull me into space. I survived, barely, saved by Force instincts I'd never trained, unconsciously pulling myself back to the ship through a power I didn't understand. And I woke in the medical bay to learn we'd lost most of our leadership, most of our fighters, that we were down to one ship and a few hundred people, and no real hope of survival. But Holdo was in command, and she bought us time with a sacrifice that defied physics, jumped the Raddus through the First Order fleet at light speed, turning a cruiser into a kinetic weapon that carved through star destroyers like they were paper. I felt her die through the Force, that strange sensitivity I'd never wanted, that burden I'd inherited from a father I'd never known. And I understood what she'd understood. Sometimes the only victory available is making your death matter, making your last act buy time for others to escape. The survivors reached Crate, that salt-covered hell where we'd hidden an old rebellion base, and we prepared for a last stand that would probably be the Resistance's end. Luke came. Actually, came appearing like a ghost from mythology, standing alone against the First Order's entire military force while we escaped through mining tunnels. I felt him die from across the planet, felt him choose death after holding off Kylo Ren and the First Order army, felt him surrender to the Force in a moment of absolute peace, and I lost the last connection to my childhood, the last person who'd known me before I became General Organa, the last Jedi who'd believed the galaxy could be healed. I cried while we flew away from Crate on the Millennium Falcon, surrounded by the few dozen Resistance fighters who'd survived, and I felt ancient, exhausted, ready to finally give up. But there was Rey and Finn and Poe, young people who still believed, who looked at me like I had answers, like I was the hope they needed to keep fighting. So I didn't give up, didn't surrender. Kept building the Resistance from remnants and refugees, kept sending intelligence reports and coordinating scattered cells, kept fighting because that's what I'd always done, what I'd learned from my father on Alderaan a lifetime ago. Hope was a discipline, not an emotion. You chose it every day, even when everything suggested it was foolish. You fought because the alternative was accepting tyranny, and I'd spent 50 years refusing to accept that. The peace negotiations on Hosnian Prime were supposed to be preliminary discussions with First Order moderates, feeling out whether diplomatic solutions might exist. I was skeptical. The First Order had never shown interest in anything but total domination, but diplomacy costs nothing but time, and we needed to try every option before committing to total war. Kiza was the First Order's representative, young and apparently reasonable, willing to discuss terms. I should have known better, should have recognized that the First Order had learned from the Empire's failure to just kill me when they had the chance. But I was tired, and maybe some part of me wanted to believe peace was possible, that all the fighting and dying might finally end. The poison was slow-acting, carefully designed to avoid immediate detection. I didn't realize I'd been compromised until 3 days later, when the symptoms started: muscle weakness, respiratory difficulty, organs beginning to shut down. The medics identified it eventually, but there was no cure, no treatment that would do more than buy me a few extra days. I had the resistance to put in order, final instructions to record, farewells to make. Han was gone, killed by our son on that bridge, murdered by the boy we'd both failed to save, so I couldn't apologize for pushing him away. Couldn't tell him I'd loved him, even when we were destroying each other. But I told Rey what she needed to know. Told Poe and Finn to keep fighting, to not let the resistance die with me. Told them hope was a choice, not a guarantee, and they had to keep choosing it. I've lived 54 years without the Force's power, led rebellions and built governments, and survived more assassination attempts than I can count using just intelligence and courage and strategic thinking. I watched my world die, lost my parents and my husband and my brother, learned my father was the galaxy's greatest monster, sent thousands of people to their deaths in the name of freedom, and through all of it, I never had visions, never felt the certainty of knowing the future, never wielded power beyond what my mind and will could generate. The Force was in my blood. I felt it sometimes in moments of intuition and desperate survival, but I never trained it, never relied on it, never let it become the foundation of who I was. That was my choice and my burden, to be Vader's daughter without his power, to be Skywalker's sister without his destiny, to lead through courage rather than mysticism, through careful planning rather than Force-guided certainty. I made mistakes, so many mistakes, each one carrying a body count that haunts my final hours, but I made them as a human being, making impossible choices with incomplete information, not as a Force user who should have known better. Maybe that matters, maybe it doesn't. The dead stay dead regardless of whether their killer was gifted or merely brave. The poison is killing me now, shutting down systems one by one, and the medics have given me maybe 8 more hours before my heart stops. I'm recording this because someone needs to understand that you don't need the Force to fight tyranny, to build hope from ashes, to refuse to surrender even when every rational calculation says you should. You need courage. You need the willingness to accept pain and loss and failure as costs rather than deterrents. You need to wake up every day and choose to keep fighting even when you're exhausted and grieving and certain that nothing you do will make a difference in the end. I am Princess Leia Organa of Alderaan, Senator, General, Rebel, Resistance Leader, Vader's daughter, Skywalker's sister, Ben Solo's mother who failed to save him from the darkness. I have led without the Force's power, loved without its certainty, survived without its protection. I have watched worlds die and rebellions rise, and empires fall, and new tyrannies grow from the ashes. I have made impossible choices and lived with their costs. I have been brave and ruthless and desperate and unbreakable. And now I am dying, killed by poison rather than combat, ending not with dramatic sacrifice but with slow organ failure in a medical bay that smells like Bacta and defeat. But the resistance survives. Rey and Finn and Poe survive. Hope survives because I taught them, like my father taught me, like I've tried to teach every generation that followed, that hope is not a passive waiting but an active choice. A daily discipline of refusing to surrender, even when surrender would be easier. The Force is with me, Luke would say, but I never needed the Force. I just needed courage. And that, at least, I've never lacked. The truth. I led without visions or destiny, without the Force's power or prescience, using just human intelligence and courage and the stubborn refusal to accept tyranny as inevitable. I was Vader's daughter who rejected his legacy, Alderaan's princess who survived her world's death, the rebellion's leader who kept fighting through decades of war and loss and impossible odds. I loved and lost, failed my son but saved my galaxy, made brutal choices and lived with their costs, without mystical certainty that I had chosen correctly. My strength was never power but conviction, the discipline of hope, The courage to keep building even as everything collapsed. The refusal to surrender while breath remained. I am dying now from poison rather than combat, ending without dramatic sacrifice, but I've taught another generation that heroism doesn't require the Force, that ordinary humans can resist empires and build rebellions and change the galaxy through nothing more than courage and will, and the daily choice to fight. That's my legacy, proof that you don't need mystical power to matter, that intelligence and determination and strategic ruthlessness can accomplish what magic cannot. That hope is a choice available to anyone brave enough to keep choosing it. The Force was in my blood, but never in my training, in my heritage, but never my foundation, and I built everything I achieved on purely human courage. That matters. That has to matter. Because if extraordinary power is required for heroism, then most of the galaxy is already defeated. But if courage alone is sufficient, then anyone can resist, anyone can fight, anyone can be the spark that reignites hope in darkness. I was that spark. I lived that truth, and now I die knowing that the fire I lit will outlive me, carried by those I taught to choose courage over certainty, action over fate, hope over despair. That's enough. That has to be enough.